Margaret Sullivan wiped the grease from her hands with a worn rag, the familiar smell of motor oil and metal shavings filling her nostrils as she stepped back from the vintage motorcycle she had been restoring. The garage workshop, once her grandfather's pride and joy, now served as her sanctuary from a world that seemed determined to remind her she didn't belong. The late afternoon sun streamed through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor where tools lay scattered like memories of better days. Margaret had inherited more than just this garage when her grandfather passed 6 months ago. She had inherited his dreams, his stories, and, most importantly, his unwavering belief that she could accomplish anything she set her mind to. "Maggie, you've got more fight in you than most men twice your size," he used to say, his weathered hands guiding hers as they worked side by side on whatever project had captured their attention that week. Those words echoed in her mind now as she prepared to close up shop for the day, knowing that tomorrow would bring another round of sideways glances and whispered doubts from the men who dominated the local shooting club. The Riverside Shooting Club had been her grandfather's second home for over 40 years. Thomas Sullivan had earned respect there not just for his marksmanship, but for his service in the Pacific Theater during World War II. His Purple Heart sat in a place of honor above the club's main fireplace, alongside photographs of other local veterans who had answered their country's call. Margaret had grown up hearing stories about that war, about the brotherhood forged in foxholes and the precision required to survive when every shot mattered. Now, 3 weeks after joining the club herself, Margaret felt like an intruder in a sacred space. The other members weren't openly hostile, but their skepticism was palpable. She could see it in their eyes when she approached the firing line, hear it in their carefully neutral tones when they offered what they considered helpful advice about stance and grip. They treated her like a child playing dress-up with daddy's gun, never quite taking her seriously enough to consider her a real competitor. The monthly competition was tomorrow, and Margaret had spent every available evening at the range, practicing with her grandfather's service rifle. The M1 Garand had seen better days, its wood stock bearing the scars of countless training exercises and the humidity of Pacific islands whose names most people couldn't pronounce. The metal showed spots of surface rust despite her careful maintenance, and the action occasionally stuck if she didn't work the bolt with just the right amount of pressure. "That old relic should be in a museum," Bradley Morrison had commented just last week, his tone carrying the kind of condescension that made Margaret's jaw tighten. Morrison owned the largest gun store in 3 counties and showed up to every competition with equipment that cost more than most people made in a month. His custom rifles were works of art, precision instruments crafted by masters of their trade and fitted with optics that could probably spot a flea on the moon. Margaret knew she couldn't compete with that kind of hardware, but something deeper than pride kept her coming back. Every time she shouldered her grandfather's rifle, she felt connected to something larger than herself. The weight of history settled into her bones, reminding her of the young man who had carried this same weapon across an ocean to fight for freedom and democracy. Thomas Sullivan had been barely older than Margaret when he landed on Guadalcanal, and he had trusted this rifle with his life. The other members of the shooting club didn't understand that connection. To them, she was just another weekend warrior trying to play soldier with obsolete equipment. They saw her calloused hands and oil-stained work clothes and made assumptions about her background, her education, her right to be there. Some were more diplomatic about their dismissal than others, but the underlying message was always the same: this wasn't a place for women, especially not women who showed up with rusty old rifles and attitudes that suggested they might actually know what they were doing. Margaret's resolve had been tested repeatedly over the past 3 weeks. The first time she had approached the firing line, nervous energy making her movements slightly jerky, she had overheard 2 members discussing whether the club should institute a minimum equipment standard to maintain their reputation. The implication was clear enough that she had almost packed up and left that very first day. Instead, she had loaded 8 rounds into the end-block clip, chambered around, and proceeded to put 7 of 8 shots into the black at 100 yards. The momentary silence that followed had been worth every sideways glance and whispered comment. She had proven she belonged, at least to herself. Proving it to everyone else was going to take more than one good string of fire. The range sessions had become a routine that anchored her weeks. Monday through Thursday, she worked in the garage, rebuilding engines and restoring classic motorcycles for clients who appreciated craftsmanship and attention to detail. Friday evenings and weekend afternoons belonged to the rifle range, where she practiced the fundamentals her grandfather had taught her during countless hunting trips and informal target sessions in the hills behind his house. Margaret's shooting style was methodical and deliberate, informed by years of mechanical work that had taught her the value of precision and consistency. She approached each shot like she approached an engine rebuild, with careful preparation, steady hands, and unwavering attention to detail. While other shooters rushed through their strings of fire, eager to see their results, Margaret took her time, breathing deeply and finding that perfect moment of stillness between heartbeats where everything aligned. The club's informal hierarchy had become clear to her during those first few sessions. At the top sat Morrison and his circle of equipment enthusiasts, men who spent more on a single rifle scope than Margaret earned in a good month. They shot from custom rests with precision ammunition that cost several dollars per round, and their targets showed the kind of groups that magazines wrote articles about. Below them were the hunting enthusiasts and weekend recreational shooters, good-natured men who enjoyed the social aspects of the club as much as the shooting itself. They welcomed newcomers with genuine friendliness and were always ready with advice about techniques or equipment. Margaret appreciated their acceptance, even if they sometimes seemed surprised when she declined their suggestions about upgrading to more modern equipment. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the occasional visitors and new members, people still finding their place in the club's social ecosystem. Margaret had expected to remain in this category for months, gradually earning acceptance through consistent attendance and respectful behavior. She hadn't expected to challenge the established order quite so directly or so soon. The confrontation with Morrison's group had been building for weeks, fed by small slights and casual dismissals that Margaret had initially tried to ignore. Last Tuesday, she had arrived at the range to find Morrison examining her grandfather's rifle with the kind of expression usually reserved for roadkill. His comments about museum pieces had been loud enough for half the range to hear, and his suggestion that she might be more comfortable with a .22 caliber trainer had crossed a line that Margaret hadn't even realized existed until that moment. "This rifle put food on my grandfather's table for 30 years after he came home from the war," she had replied, her voice level but carrying an edge that made several nearby shooters look up from their preparations. "I think it'll do just fine for putting holes in paper targets." Morrison's laugh had been dismissive, the kind of sound that suggested he was humoring a child who insisted on playing with toys meant for adults. "Sweetheart, there's a difference between hunting deer and competitive target shooting. You might want to consider something with a little more precision if you're serious about this sport." The endearment had been delivered with just enough condescension to make Margaret's hands clench into fists, but she had forced herself to remain calm. Getting into an argument would only confirm their assumptions about emotional women who couldn't handle the pressure of competition. Instead, she had shouldered her rifle, assumed her shooting position, and proceeded to demonstrate exactly what kind of precision her grandfather's old war rifle could deliver. That evening's target had shown a group that would have been respectable with any equipment, but Morrison had managed to find fault even in success. "Not bad for a lucky day," he had commented, examining the target with grudging approval. "Let's see if you can do it when it counts." The challenge had been issued casually, almost as an afterthought, but Margaret understood the implications. Tomorrow's monthly competition would be her real test, the moment when the club's unofficial judges would decide whether she belonged or whether her previous performances had been statistical anomalies. She could continue attending the club regardless of how she shot, but her standing within the group would be determined by how she performed when the scores mattered. Margaret had spent the evening cleaning and inspecting every component of her grandfather's rifle, a ritual that had become as much about meditation as maintenance. The familiar routine of disassembly and cleaning helped her focus, each step in the process reminding her of the countless times she had watched her grandfather perform the same tasks. His hands had been steady and sure as he explained the function of each part, the importance of proper maintenance, and the respect that should be shown to any tool that might be called upon to save your life. "A rifle is like any other precision instrument," he had told her during one of their sessions. "Treat it right, and it'll perform when you need it to. Neglect it, and it'll let you down at the worst possible moment. The key is consistency, Maggie. Same routine every time, same attention to detail, same respect for the process." Those lessons had served her well in her professional life, where attention to detail meant the difference between a smooth-running engine and a catastrophic failure. Now she applied the same principles to her shooting, treating each range session as an opportunity to refine her technique and deepen her understanding of ballistics and marksmanship fundamentals. The weather forecast for tomorrow called for light winds and clear skies, conditions that would favor accuracy and minimize the variables that could affect bullet flight. Margaret had checked and rechecked her equipment, loaded her ammunition with the kind of care that would have made her grandfather proud, and reviewed her shooting diary to identify any patterns in her performance that might give her an edge in the competition. Sleep had been elusive that night, not because of nervousness but because of anticipation. Margaret felt ready for the challenge ahead, confident in her preparation and eager to demonstrate what she and her grandfather's rifle could accomplish when given the chance to perform without distractions or commentary from skeptical observers. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of the old house settling around her, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months ago, she had been a successful businesswoman running her grandfather's garage and building a reputation for quality work that attracted customers from across the state. She had been content with her life, satisfied with the progress she was making both personally and professionally. Then, her grandfather had passed, and with him had gone the steadying influence that had shaped so much of her worldview. Thomas Sullivan had been more than just a grandfather, he had been mentor, friend, and the one person who had never doubted her ability to succeed in whatever field she chose to enter. His death had left a void that she was still learning to navigate, but it had also awakened something that had been dormant for too long. The shooting club had initially been just another way to honor his memory, a place where she could maintain a connection to the activities they had shared. Margaret hadn't expected to find herself drawn into competition or confronted with attitudes that seemed to question her fundamental right to participate. She certainly hadn't anticipated that proving herself would become such an important part of processing her grief and establishing her own identity independent of her grandfather's influence. Tomorrow would mark a turning point, regardless of how she performed. Win or lose, she would have demonstrated her commitment to the sport and her willingness to compete on equal terms with anyone who chose to challenge her. The outcome would determine whether she continued to face skepticism and condescension or whether she earned the kind of respect that came only through demonstrated competence under pressure. Margaret finally drifted off to sleep sometime after midnight, her dreams filled with images of distant targets and the solid feel of her grandfather's rifle against her shoulder. In her subconscious mind, she could hear his voice offering encouragement and technical advice, reminding her that confidence came not from the equipment you carried but from the preparation you had invested and the principles you refused to compromise. Dawn broke gray and overcast, the kind of morning that seemed to muffle sound and cast everything in muted tones. Margaret arrived at the Riverside Shooting Club 40 minutes before the competition was scheduled to begin, her grandfather's rifle case slung over one shoulder and a canvas bag containing her shooting accessories weighing down the other. The parking lot was already half full, expensive pickup trucks and SUVs lined up in neat rows like soldiers awaiting inspection. She recognized most of the vehicles from her evening practice sessions, but this morning they seemed somehow more imposing, their polished chrome and pristine paint jobs serving as extensions of their owners' personalities. Margaret's own truck, a 15-year-old Ford with honest rust spots and a work-worn interior, looked distinctly out of place among the display of automotive prosperity. She parked at the far end of the lot, not out of shame but from a practical desire to avoid any unnecessary interactions before the competition began. The clubhouse hummed with activity as members checked in, paid their entry fees, and engaged in the kind of pre-competition banter that seemed designed more to establish pecking order than to build camaraderie. Margaret signed her name on the roster, noting with interest that she was the only woman registered for the high-power rifle division. 23 other names appeared above and below hers, representing what she assumed was the core membership of the club's most serious competitive shooters. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Bradley Morrison announced from across the room, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure that his comment reached every corner of the building. "I wasn't sure you'd show up today, sweetheart. This isn't like those casual evening sessions you've been attending." Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being the center of unwanted attention, but she kept her expression neutral as she turned to face Morrison and his usual cluster of followers. "Good morning, Bradley. Looking forward to the competition." "That's the spirit," Morrison replied, his tone suggesting he was congratulating a child for attempting something beyond her capabilities. "Win or lose, it's the participation that counts, right boys?" The chorus of agreement that followed was half-hearted, as if some of the men understood that Morrison was crossing lines that didn't need to be crossed. Margaret caught the eye of Frank Delacroix, one of the older members who had served with her grandfather in the Pacific. His slight nod and encouraging smile provided a welcome counterpoint to Morrison's casual cruelty. "The weather's perfect for shooting," Frank said, stepping into the conversation with the kind of diplomatic skill that came from years of managing difficult personalities. "Light winds, good visibility. Should make for some interesting scores today." Assuming everyone's equipment is up to the challenge, Morrison added, his gaze settling on Margaret's rifle case with obvious skepticism. "Some of us might find out that rusty old relics aren't quite as reliable as they'd hoped." Margaret had planned to ignore Morrison's provocations, but something about the way he dismissed her grandfather's service rifle triggered a response that came from deeper than tactical consideration. "This rifle was reliable enough to help win a war," she said quietly. "I think it can handle a friendly shooting competition."
The silence that followed lasted just long enough to become uncomfortable before Morrison's laugh broke the tension. "I guess we'll find out, won't we? Should be entertaining either way."
The range safety officer called for shooters to begin setting up their equipment, providing Margaret with an excuse to escape the clubhouse atmosphere and focus on the mechanical preparations that had become second nature over the past few weeks. She chose a firing point near the center of the line, close enough to the other competitors to hear their conversations but far enough away to maintain some psychological space. Unpacking her equipment was a familiar ritual that helped calm her nerves and center her attention on the task ahead. The leather rifle case, worn smooth by decades of use, opened to reveal her grandfather's M1 Garand nestled in foam padding that she had custom cut to fit the rifle's profile. The metal showed the patina of age and careful maintenance, but every component moved smoothly and locked up tight. Margaret had test-fired the rifle the previous weekend, confirming that her hand-loaded ammunition was producing consistent velocities and that the iron sights were properly zeroed for the 100-yard targets they would be shooting. To her left, Morrison was assembling what looked like a precision instrument disguised as a rifle. The bolt-action chassis was machined from aerospace-grade aluminum, the barrel was a hand-lapped masterpiece from one of the premium manufacturers, and the scope cost more than Margaret's truck. Every component had been selected for maximum accuracy and adjusted to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. It was an impressive display of what money and technology could accomplish when applied to the problem of putting bullets exactly where they were intended to go. "Nice setup," Margaret commented, genuinely appreciating the craftsmanship even if she questioned the necessity of such expensive equipment for a local club competition. Morrison glanced over at her rifle with an expression that suggested he was looking at a historical curiosity. "Thanks. I believe in using the right tool for the job. Speaking of which, are you sure that thing is going to hold together for 70 rounds? Some of these old military rifles can be pretty temperamental when you start pushing them." "It's held together for 70 years, Margaret replied. "I think it can manage one more afternoon." The pre-competition safety briefing covered procedures that Margaret had memorized during her first visit to the club, but she listened attentively anyway. Range safety was serious business, and even experienced shooters could benefit from occasional reminders about proper protocol. The match format was straightforward, 10 rounds each at 7 different stages, ranging from standing unsupported at 50 yards to prone precision shooting at 200 yards. Scoring was based on cumulative points, with each shot valued according to its proximity to the center of the target. Margaret had practiced every stage multiple times during her evening sessions, but she knew that competition shooting introduced variables that couldn't be replicated during casual practice. The pressure of being watched and scored, the knowledge that every shot would be scrutinized and compared to her competitor's performance, and the accumulated fatigue of shooting 70 rounds in succession would test not just her marksmanship skills but her mental resilience. The first stage was standing offhand at 50 yards, a position that favored shooters with strong fundamentals and natural stability. Margaret had always been good at this stage, her years of physical work having given her the core strength and body awareness that translated into a solid shooting platform. She watched the first relay of shooters take their positions, noting the variety of techniques and equipment configurations represented across the line. Morrison shot with mechanical precision, his expensive rifle and competition accessories allowing him to focus entirely on trigger control and sight alignment. His scores reflected the advantages of superior equipment, but Margaret also recognized genuine skill in the way he managed his breathing and maintained consistent form through the entire string of fire. Whatever personal issues she might have with his attitude, she couldn't deny that he was a capable marksman who had earned his reputation through more than just expensive gear. When her relay was called to the line, Margaret felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied any moment of truth. She assumed her shooting position, feeling the weight of her grandfather's rifle settle into place against her shoulder. The iron sights, simple but effective, framed the black bullseye with the clarity that came from countless hours of practice and proper sight alignment. The range commands followed the familiar sequence that had been standardized across competitive shooting for decades. Load and make ready. Margaret inserted an 8-round end-block clip, felt the bolt slam forward to chamber a round, and engaged the safety. Is the line ready? A pause while the range safety officer confirmed that all shooters were prepared. The line is ready. Commence firing. The first shot surprised her with its recoil, not because it was unexpected but because the adrenaline had heightened her sensitivity to every aspect of the shooting process. The sight picture had been perfect, her trigger press smooth and straight back, and the follow-through automatic after years of ingrained training. She worked the bolt, ejecting the spent case and chambering a fresh round, then settled back into her shooting position for the second shot. By the fourth round, Margaret had found her rhythm. The external pressure and awareness of being watched had faded into background noise, replaced by the meditative focus that came when technique became automatic and conscious thought narrowed to the essential elements of sight alignment and trigger control. Her grandfather's rifle cycled smoothly with each shot, the action worn to perfection through decades of careful use and maintenance. When the command to cease fire ended the first stage, Margaret felt confident about her performance even before the targets were scored. Her shots had felt good, the kind of solid hits that came when everything worked together properly. She unloaded her rifle, engaged the safety, and waited for the targets to be retrieved and scored. The results posted 15 minutes later confirmed her assessment. Margaret's score of 94 out of a possible 100 placed her third overall for the stage, behind Morrison's 98 and another competitor's 96. More importantly, her performance had been consistent, with no wild shots or obvious technical failures that might indicate problems with her equipment or preparation. "Not bad for a warm-up," Morrison commented as he reviewed the posted scores. His tone was less dismissive than it had been earlier, suggesting that her shooting had earned at least grudging recognition of competence. "Let's see how you do when the distances get serious." The second stage moved the shooting line back to 75 yards and required shooters to assume a sitting position with sling support. This was where Margaret expected her military surplus equipment to provide some advantage, as the M1 Garand had been designed for exactly this type of practical field shooting. The web sling her grandfather had carried during the war was worn soft but still functionally sound, and Margaret had spent hours perfecting her technique for quickly and consistently getting into a stable sitting position. She watched Morrison struggle slightly with this stage, his precision rifle's heavy barrel and specialized stock making it less than ideal for the rapid position changes and sling-supported shooting that the stage required. His expensive bipod, perfectly suited for bench rest precision shooting, couldn't be used under the competition rules, and his unfamiliarity with traditional sling technique showed in his slightly awkward positioning and longer than optimal setup time. Margaret's relay took the line with the confidence that came from solid performance in the previous stage. The sitting position felt natural to her, muscle memory from countless hunting trips and practice sessions guiding her into a stable, comfortable shooting platform. The sling tension was exactly where she wanted it, tight enough to provide support but not so tight as to interfere with her natural point of aim or breathing cycle. This time, the shooting felt even more controlled than the first stage. The additional support of the sitting position and sling created a steadier platform, and Margaret could see her sight picture hold with minimal movement as she worked through each shot. Her grandfather's rifle seemed to come alive in her hands, responding to her input with the kind of precision that could only come from a weapon that had been properly maintained and thoughtfully used. The targets told the story when they were retrieved and scored. Margaret's 97 out of 100 was the highest score for the stage, edging out Morrison's 96 and establishing her as a serious contender for the overall competition. The implications of that performance weren't lost on the other competitors, and Margaret noticed a subtle shift in the way they looked at her and spoke about her shooting. "Impressive," Frank Delacroix said as they reviewed the results. "Your grandfather would be proud of that shooting. Tommy always said that rifle shot better than it looked." Morrison's reaction was less gracious but more telling. His casual confidence had been replaced by focused attention to his own equipment and technique, and Margaret noticed him making adjustments to his scope and checking his ammunition selection with the kind of intensity that suggested he was taking the competition more seriously than he had expected. The third and fourth stages continued the trend, with Margaret's scores remaining consistently high while some of her competitors began to show the effects of pressure and accumulated fatigue. Her grandfather's rifle continued to perform flawlessly, its simple but robust design proving well suited to the demands of extended competitive shooting. Each stage brought different challenges, but Margaret found herself adapting easily, drawing on the broad foundation of skills that her grandfather had insisted on developing during their training sessions. By the halfway point of the competition, Margaret had established herself as the shooter to beat. Her cumulative score led the field by 4 points, with Morrison trailing in second place and showing signs of frustration that were beginning to affect his normally precise technique. The other competitors had settled into supporting roles, shooting for personal satisfaction and bragging rights but no longer realistically contending for the overall victory. The transformation in atmosphere was subtle but unmistakable. Margaret's initial treatment as an interesting novelty had given way to genuine respect from most of the competitors and barely concealed resentment from Morrison and his closest associates. comments about rusty old rifles and museum pieces had been replaced by technical discussions about her shooting technique and grudging acknowledgement that her equipment was performing better than its appearance might suggest. "You're making the rest of us look bad," one of the hunting enthusiasts joked during the break before the final stages. "I may have to get myself one of those old battle rifles if they shoot like that." Margaret appreciated the compliment, but she also understood that her success was creating tensions that went beyond simple competitive rivalry. For some of the members, her performance challenged assumptions about equipment, gender roles, and the natural order of things that had remained unchallenged for years. Winning the competition would be satisfying, but it would also mark her as a permanent outsider in some circles. As they prepared for the final 3 stages of the competition, Margaret reflected on how much had changed since her nervous first visit to the club 3 weeks earlier. She had proven to herself and to most of the other members that she belonged on the firing line, that her grandfather's rifle was capable of precision shooting, and that determination and proper preparation could overcome skepticism and superior equipment. The most challenging stages still lay ahead, including the 200-yard prone precision shooting that would test both her marksmanship skills and her equipment's accuracy potential. Morrison would undoubtedly rally for a strong finish, and his specialized long-range rifle would be most advantageous in the final stages. But Margaret felt confident in her preparation and her equipment, ready to finish what she had started and prove that sometimes the old ways were still the best ways. The afternoon sun had burned through the morning overcast, creating the kind of clear, bright conditions that could either help or hurt a shooter depending on how well they managed the changing light. Margaret squinted downrange toward the 200-yard targets, barely visible as small white squares against the brown earthen backstop. This was where competitions were often decided, where the combination of distance, precision, and pressure separated the casual marksman from the serious competitors. She knelt behind the firing line, organizing her equipment for the final 3 stages with the methodical care that had served her well throughout the morning. Her grandfather's rifle showed no signs of the strain from 40 rounds of competition shooting. The action cycled smoothly, the trigger broke cleanly, and the barrel remained cool enough to handle comfortably despite the afternoon warmth. Modern rifles might offer technological advantages, but there was something to be said for the robust simplicity of a design that had been proven in combat across 2 decades and dozens of conflicts. Morrison had recovered some of his earlier confidence during the break between stages, but Margaret noticed tension in his movements that hadn't been there at the beginning of the competition. His expensive rifle was performing exactly as advertised, delivering the kind of precision that justified its premium price, but equipment advantages meant little when human factors began to influence performance. The pressure of an unexpectedly close competition was affecting everyone, but some shooters handled stress better than others. "Longest stages coming up," Frank Delacroix observed as he checked his own equipment. "This is where we'll see what everyone's really made of. 200 yards is where the rifles start talking and the shooters start listening." Margaret appreciated Frank's diplomatic way of acknowledging the significance of the final stages without directly referencing the ongoing rivalry between herself and Morrison. As one of the club's senior members and a veteran of her grandfather's generation, Frank carried the kind of moral authority that allowed him to comment on competitions without seeming to take sides. His presence on the firing line provided a steadying influence that helped keep personalities and egos from completely dominating the sporting aspects of the event. The 5th stage required shooters to assume a prone position with shooting jacket and sling for maximum stability. Margaret had practiced this position extensively, understanding that it represented the most accurate shooting platform available to a rifleman using iron sights and traditional equipment. Her grandfather had emphasized the importance of building a consistent, comfortable prone position that could be assumed quickly and held for extended periods without fatigue or muscle tension affecting accuracy. Margaret's shooting jacket was a civilian version of the heavy canvas garments used by military and competitive shooters, reinforced at the elbows and equipped with hooks for sling attachment. The jacket felt stiff and slightly restrictive compared to her usual work clothes, but it provided the stable platform and consistent positioning that made precision shooting possible. She had learned to ignore the discomfort, focusing instead on the improved stability and reduced sensitivity to external conditions that the jacket provided. Setting up for the prone stage involved a complex sequence of adjustments and positioning that had to be completed within the time limits imposed by the competition format. Margaret spread her shooting mat on the concrete firing line, adjusted her rifle sling to the proper tension, and settled into the prone position with the kind of fluid efficiency that came from countless repetitions during practice sessions. Her shooting position felt solid and natural, every point of contact between her body and the ground contributing to a stable platform that would minimize the effects of breathing, heartbeat, and involuntary muscle movements on her rifle's alignment with the target. The M1 Garand's weight, which some shooters considered a disadvantage, actually helped dampen small movements and provided the kind of steady hold that was essential for precision shooting at extended ranges. Through her iron sights, the 200-yard target appeared as a small black circle with scoring rings barely visible even in the good light conditions. This was where the limitations of her grandfather's rifle would be most apparent, where Morrison's expensive optics and precision ammunition would provide clear advantages that skill alone might not be able to overcome. Margaret understood the challenge she faced, but she also trusted in the preparation and practice that had brought her this far. The range commands began the familiar sequence that would determine whether her morning's success could be sustained through the most demanding portion of the competition. Margaret felt her breathing slow and her focus narrow to the essential elements of sight alignment and trigger control. External distractions faded into background noise as her entire world contracted to the relationship between her front sight, rear sight, and the distant target. Her first shot felt perfect from the moment the firing pin fell. The surprise break of the trigger, the solid recoil impulse transmitted through her shooting position, and the clean follow-through all suggested a well-executed shot that should find the center of the target. Margaret worked the bolt, ejecting the spent case and chambering a fresh round, then settled back into her shooting position with the confidence that came from starting a string with a good shot. The second and third shots maintained the same level of quality, each one feeling like a natural extension of her shooting position and sight picture. Margaret's rhythm was smooth and unhurried, allowing plenty of time for each shot while maintaining the concentration necessary for precision shooting. Her grandfather's rifle was performing beautifully, delivering the kind of accuracy that validated his faith in the weapon and her decision to compete with equipment that others had dismissed as obsolete. By the time she reached the eighth and final shot of the stage, Margaret knew she had shot well enough to maintain her leading position in the competition. The feeling of each shot, the sight picture at the moment of firing, and the consistent recoil impulse all indicated that her bullets were finding the target where they were supposed to. She completed her final shot with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized the entire string, then unloaded her rifle and waited for the targets to be retrieved and scored. Morrison finished his string a few seconds after Margaret, his normally fluid shooting style showing signs of the pressure he was feeling. His expensive equipment was performing flawlessly, but Margaret noticed small deviations in his technique that suggested he was working harder than usual to maintain his concentration and consistency. Competition pressure affected everyone differently, and even experienced shooters could find their performance degraded when they felt the need to produce exceptional results. The scoring seemed to take longer than usual, though Margaret knew that perception was influenced by her anticipation of the results. 200 yards was a significant distance for iron sight shooting, and even small errors in technique or equipment could result in shots that missed the scoring rings entirely. She felt confident about her own performance, but until the scores were posted, there was always the possibility that mechanical factors or environmental conditions had influenced bullet flight in ways that weren't apparent to the shooter. When the targets were finally posted, Margaret's score of 96 out of 100 represented the highest individual stage score of the entire competition. More importantly, it extended her overall lead to 7 points, putting significant pressure on Morrison and the other competitors to produce exceptional results in the remaining stages. Her grandfather's rifle had performed magnificently at the distance where its age and simplicity should have been most disadvantageous. "Outstanding shooting," Frank said as he reviewed the posted scores. "Tommy would be amazed to see what you're doing with his old rifle." 96 at 200 yards with iron sights is serious marksmanship. Morrison's reaction was more complex, combining professional appreciation for good shooting with personal frustration at falling further behind in a competition he had expected to dominate. His score of 93 was excellent by any objective standard, but it wasn't good enough to make up ground against Margaret's consistent performance. For the first time since the competition began, Morrison looked like a man who was beginning to understand that he might not win. The sixth stage required rapid-fire shooting from the standing position, a discipline that tested both marksmanship skills and equipment reliability under stress. 10 shots had to be fired in 60 seconds from a standing unsupported position at 100 yards, challenging shooters to balance speed with accuracy while managing the physiological effects of time pressure and adrenaline. Margaret had always enjoyed rapid-fire stages because they played to her strengths as a shooter who had learned marksmanship in practical rather than theoretical contexts. Her grandfather's training had emphasized shooting skills that would be useful in hunting and field conditions, where quick, accurate shooting was often more important than laboratory precision. The M1 Garand's semi-automatic action and 8-round capacity made it well suited for rapid fire, and Margaret had practiced the stage extensively to ensure that her technique remained sound even under time pressure. As she took her position for the rapid fire stage, Margaret felt a different kind of nervous energy than she had experienced during the precision shooting. Time pressure added a layer of complexity that required her to trust her training and let muscle memory guide her movements without conscious interference. 60 seconds seemed like plenty of time in theory, but in practice the clock could become an adversary that forced poor decisions and rushed shots. The command to commence firing triggered an immediate shift in Margaret's mindset from careful precision to controlled urgency. Her first shot broke within 2 seconds of the command, the sight picture adequate rather than perfect but still good enough to find the scoring area of the target. The M1 Garand's action cycled smoothly, ejecting the spent case and chambering a fresh round while Margaret reacquired her sight picture and pressed the trigger for her second shot. Her rhythm during the rapid-fire stage was different from the measured pace of precision shooting, but it was still controlled and deliberate. Each shot received enough attention to ensure proper sight alignment and trigger control, but without the extended sight picture and careful breathing cycle that characterized her slower fire technique. Margaret's years of mechanical work had given her good hand-eye coordination and the ability to perform precise movements quickly and consistently. The en-bloc clip ejected with its distinctive metallic ping after the 8th shot, and Margaret smoothly inserted her second clip to complete the final 2 shots of the stage. The sound of the clip ejecting was music to her ears, indicating that her grandfather's rifle was functioning exactly as it had been designed to function 70 years earlier. The final 2 shots felt as solid as the first 8, and Margaret was confident that she had maintained her accuracy even under time pressure. When the command to cease fire ended the stage, Margaret realized that she had finished with nearly 10 seconds remaining on the clock. Her shooting had been fast enough to complete the stage comfortably while maintaining the kind of sight picture and trigger control that produced accurate results. Around her, other shooters were still working to complete their strings, some of them clearly struggling with the time pressure and the challenge of balancing speed with accuracy. Morrison finished his string with only 2 seconds to spare, his normally smooth technique showing obvious signs of the pressure he was feeling. His expensive bolt-action rifle was poorly suited for rapid-fire competition, requiring him to work the bolt manually after each shot and reload individual rounds rather than using the detachable magazines that modern rapid-fire rifles employed. The equipment that gave him advantages in precision shooting became a liability when speed was equally important. The rapid-fire scores reinforced the trends that had been developing throughout the competition. Margaret's 92 out of 100 was again the highest stage score, while Morrison's 87 reflected the challenges he was facing with equipment that was optimized for precision rather than versatility. Her overall lead had grown to 12 points with only 1 stage remaining, putting her in a commanding position to win the competition. "Looks like someone's going to learn a lesson about bringing the right tool for the job," one of the other competitors commented quietly, the implications clear even though names weren't mentioned. Margaret pretended not to hear the remark, but she understood that her success was being interpreted as more than just good shooting. She was proving that expensive, specialized equipment wasn't always superior to well-maintained, properly used traditional gear. The final stage would be shot at 300 yards from the prone position, the ultimate test of both shooter and equipment accuracy. This was Morrison's last chance to make up the deficit that had been growing throughout the afternoon, and Margaret knew he would produce his best shooting of the day in an attempt to salvage his reputation and maintain his status as the club's premier marksman. As she prepared for the final stage, Margaret reflected on how much her relationship with the club and its members had changed over the course of a single afternoon. She had arrived as an outsider whose participation was tolerated but not particularly welcomed, and she was about to finish as the winner of their most important monthly competition. The implications of that transformation went beyond simple competitive success, establishing her as a permanent part of the club's culture and challenging assumptions that some members had held for years. The 300-yard targets were barely visible even with the excellent lighting conditions, appearing as tiny white squares that seemed to waver and dance in the heat mirage rising from the sun-warmed ground. At this distance, even small errors in technique or equipment would be magnified into significant deviations from the point of aim. This was where the true test of marksmanship would be conducted, where pretenders would be separated from genuine marksmen, and where Margaret would discover whether her grandfather's faith in his old rifle had been justified. The 300-yard line felt different from the shorter distances, as if the additional 100 yards had transported Margaret into a realm where different rules applied and smaller margins for error existed. The targets appeared almost impossibly distant, reduced to tiny white squares that seemed to shimmer and move in the afternoon heat waves rising from the sun-warmed earth between the firing line and the backstop. Margaret settled into her prone position with the deliberate care that extreme-range shooting demanded, every aspect of her shooting platform requiring perfect alignment and rock-solid stability. Her grandfather's rifle felt heavier at this distance, not physically but psychologically, as if the weapon itself understood the significance of what was being asked of it. The iron sights, perfectly adequate at shorter ranges, now seemed almost primitive compared to the high-magnification optics that most of her competitors were employing. Morrison lay 3 positions to her right, and Margaret could hear him making final adjustments to his scope settings and checking wind flags with the intensity of a man who understood that this was his last opportunity to salvage what had started as a routine demonstration of superiority. His expensive rifle was in its element at this distance, designed specifically for the kind of precision shooting that separated casual marksmen from serious competitors. Winds picking up slightly from the left, Frank observed quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been reading wind conditions since before most of the other competitors were born. Nothing dramatic, but enough to push bullets if you don't account for it. Margaret nodded her acknowledgement while continuing her pre-shooting routine, checking her sling tension and verifying that her shooting position was as solid and repeatable as she could make it. Wind was always a factor in precision shooting, but at 300 yards even a slight crosswind could move bullets several inches away from the point of aim. Reading and compensating for wind conditions was one of the most challenging aspects of long-range marksmanship, requiring experience and judgment that couldn't be purchased with expensive equipment. Through her iron sights, Margaret could barely make out the black bullseye at the center of the distant target. The front sight post covered an area that was larger than the highest scoring rings, making precise aiming more a matter of consistent sight picture than exact alignment with specific portions of the target. This was where her grandfather's training and practical marksmanship would be most valuable, where the ability to achieve repeatable results under field conditions mattered more than laboratory precision. The range officer called the shooters to the line and began the familiar sequence of commands that would conclude the day's competition. Margaret felt her breathing slow and her heartbeat steady as she settled into the meditative state that preceded her best shooting. External distractions faded away, replaced by intense focus on the relationship between her rifle, the distant target, and the environmental conditions that would influence bullet flight. Load and make ready. Margaret inserted a fresh end-block clip, feeling the bolt slam forward to chamber around. The mechanical action of her grandfather's rifle was as smooth and positive as it had been during the first stage, showing no signs of wear or fatigue despite the afternoon's extended use. The trigger felt exactly as it should, clean and crisp with just enough weight to prevent accidental discharge while allowing precise control over the moment of firing. Is the line ready? The pause that followed allowed Margaret to complete her final preparations, adjusting her position fractionally to account for the slight breeze that was moving the wind flags at the target line. Her natural point of aim seemed solid, requiring no muscular effort to maintain the rifle's alignment with the distant target. Years of practice had taught her to recognize when everything felt right, when her shooting position was optimized for the best possible results. The line is ready. Commence firing. Margaret's first shot surprised her with its clarity. Despite the distance and the challenges of iron sight shooting, the sight picture had been clean and the trigger break exactly where she expected it. The recoil impulse felt normal, and her follow-through was automatic and smooth. She worked the bolt, ejecting the spent case and chambering a fresh round, then settled back into position for her second shot. The rhythm she established was slower than it had been at shorter ranges, allowing more time for each shot while maintaining the concentration necessary for precision shooting. At 300 yards, every aspect of marksmanship technique became magnified in importance. Breathing, trigger control, sight alignment, and follow-through all had to be executed perfectly for bullets to find their intended target. Margaret's third shot felt even better than the first two, the kind of shot that competitive marksmen described as calling because they knew from the moment of firing exactly where the bullet would strike. The sight picture had been perfect, the trigger press smooth and straight back, and the natural point of aim consistent with her previous shots. Her confidence grew with each successful shot, reinforcing her belief that her grandfather's rifle was capable of precision that matched or exceeded anything that modern equipment could deliver. By the time she reached her sixth shot, Margaret had found the kind of rhythm that characterized her best shooting. Each shot flowed naturally from her shooting position, the mechanical process of working the bolt and chambering fresh rounds becoming automatic while her conscious mind focused on sight alignment and trigger control. The M1 Garand was performing flawlessly, its simple but robust design proving ideally suited for the demands of sustained precision shooting.
Morrison was struggling.
Margaret could hear the frustration in his movements as he adjusted his position repeatedly, searching for the stability and consistency that had eluded him throughout the final stage. His expensive rifle was capable of exceptional accuracy, but equipment advantages meant nothing when the human factors weren't working properly. The pressure of trying to make up a significant deficit in the final stage was affecting his normally precise technique. Margaret's eighth shot completed her string with the same attention to detail that had characterized every shot of the stage. She knew without seeing the target that she had shot well, that her grandfather's rifle had delivered the kind of performance that would validate her decision to compete with equipment that others had dismissed as obsolete. The feeling of each shot, the consistency of her sight picture, and the solid recoil impulse all indicated that her bullets had found their intended target. When the command to cease fire ended the competition, Margaret felt a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. She had completed 70 rounds of competitive shooting without a single mechanical failure or significant error in technique. Her grandfather's rifle had performed magnificently, proving that proper maintenance and careful use could extend the effective life of well-designed equipment far beyond what casual observers might expect.
The scoring process seemed to take forever, though Margaret knew that 300-yard targets required careful examination to determine precise shot placement.
She used the time to clean her rifle and pack her equipment, following the same methodical routine that had served her throughout the day. Win or lose, she had demonstrated that she belonged in competitive shooting and that her grandfather's faith in his old rifle had been justified. When the final scores were posted, the results told a story that would be remembered long after the trophies were awarded and the competitors returned home. Margaret's final stage score of 95 out of 100 was the highest of the day at any distance, pushing her total score to 671 out of a possible 700 points. Morrison's struggles in the final stage had dropped him to second place with 659 points, a respectable score that would have won the competition in most circumstances. The silence that followed the posting of results lasted longer than Margaret had expected, as if the implications of what had just occurred required time to be fully processed. She had not only won the competition but had done so decisively, using equipment that some members had suggested belonged in a museum rather than on a competitive firing line. Outstanding shooting, Frank said finally, his voice carrying genuine admiration.
Tommy would have been proud as hell to see what you did with his rifle today.
95 at 300 yards with iron sights is something special. The congratulations that followed came from most of the competitors, men who understood the difficulty of what Margaret had accomplished and were generous enough to acknowledge superior performance regardless of their personal opinions about women in competitive shooting. Morrison's congratulations were brief and somewhat strained, but he managed the gracious behavior that competitive etiquette required. "Nice shooting," he said, extending his hand.
"I guess that old rifle had some surprises left in it."
Margaret shook his hand and accepted the compliment with the grace that her grandfather had taught her was appropriate in victory.
"Thank you.
It was a good competition." As the club members began to pack their equipment and prepare to leave, Margaret reflected on how much had changed since her nervous arrival that morning. She had proven something important to herself and to the club, demonstrating that determination and proper preparation could overcome skepticism and technological disadvantage. More importantly, she had honored her grandfather's memory by showing that his lessons and his rifle were still relevant in a modern world.
The drive home that evening was different from any trip Margaret could remember.
The trophy in her passenger seat was tangible proof of what she had accomplished, but the real victory was internal. She had found her place in a community that initially seemed unwelcoming, had validated her decision to honor her grandfather's legacy through competitive shooting, and had proven that old equipment in skilled hands could still compete with the latest technology. The garage workshop where she worked on motorcycles would never look quite the same again. It was still the place where she earned her living and pursued her passion for mechanical restoration, but now it was also the training ground where she would prepare for future competitions. Her grandfather's rifle would continue to receive the same careful maintenance it had always received, but now it would also see regular use in the pursuit of marksmanship excellence. Margaret had found something she didn't know she was looking for, a way to honor her grandfather's memory while establishing her own identity as a competitive marksman. The skepticism and condescension she had faced would likely continue, but now she had the confidence that came from proven performance under pressure. She belonged on the firing line not because of anyone's permission or approval, but because she had earned her place through skill and determination. The monthly competitions would take on new significance now that she had established herself as a serious contender. Other members would adjust their expectations and their training to account for the challenge she represented, and Margaret would need to continue improving to maintain her competitive edge. But she welcomed the challenge, knowing that her grandfather's lessons and his rifle would continue to serve her well in whatever competitions lay ahead. As she pulled into her driveway and saw the familiar outline of her workshop against the evening sky, Margaret smiled at the memory of Morrison's surprised expression when the final scores were posted. The rusty old rifle that he had suggested belonged in a museum had just taught him and everyone else at the club a lesson about the enduring value of quality craftsmanship and proper maintenance. Tomorrow she would return to her regular work of rebuilding engines and restoring vintage motorcycles, but now that work would be informed by the confidence that came from competitive success. She had proven that the skills her grandfather taught her, attention to detail, respect for quality tools, and the patience to do things properly, were applicable far beyond the garage workshop where she had first learned them. Margaret Sullivan had found her place in a larger community, had honored her grandfather's memory in a way that he would have appreciated, and had proven that sometimes the old ways were still the best ways. The rusty World War II rifle that had carried her grandfather through one kind of challenge had now carried her through another, creating a bridge between past and present that would influence everything she did in the future. The story would be told and retold in the club's informal history, becoming part of the folklore that connected current members to the shooters who had come before them. Margaret had become part of that tradition, not as an outsider who had been grudgingly accepted but as a competitor who had earned her place through skill and determination. Her grandfather's rifle had found new purpose, and Margaret had found a community where his lessons would continue to be relevant for years to come.